If you had asked me about a year ago when I think the first AVs will be tested on public roads, I would have said, yeah, we're about 5 to 10 years away. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong, because as of May this year, 53 companies have been licensed in the state of California to test on public roads, level 4 and level 5. So we're moving into new technology and the speed of change and transformation that is happening in our cities with transportation, while at the same time looking at some of the more traditional shared mobility options, in particular car sharing. As Molly has said, movmi is focused on creating more livable cities with all sorts of different shared mobility providers. We've earned our stripes in car sharing, so if you're from Vancouver, you probably know Evo, BCAA's black free-floating car sharing model with the blue bike racks, but we've also worked in the US and more exotically in Dubai, where we introduced the very first car share that started with 15 cars to convince the Road Transportation Authority that this can actually technologically work, and is now in operations of 500 cars. When we talk about shared mobility, we call ourselves shared mobility architects, because it really is about three things now. US transportation planners know this, but us in shared mobility, it took us a while to realize this. It's about infrastructure. So where do you park your shared mobility vehicles, whether this is a bike or it's a car, but also where do you have pickup and drop-off zones that are safe, especially when AV comes in the mix. It's about the vehicles, and the vehicles is where most of the industry focus, or I should say, most of the news focuses the attention, because it's the new shiny object syndrome, as we heard today. They're becoming connected and shared directly from the car manufacturer. We're moving from traditional combustion engine more towards electric vehicles. And with increased sensor technology to AV, the sensor technology initially was on the outside. Now it's also moving inside the vehicles, because you have to provide a safe and clean experience. And on top of that, the whole vehicle management, whether this is bikes or cars, you need a lot of software and technology to make that happen. And then last but not least, it's the humans. They have the same amount of real estate on this triangle. They really should have a lot more, because if you don't have any members using your service, then you have no viable business model. We survey super users, which are people who use multiple different shared mobility services on a regular basis, and they tell us the same thing over and over again. If you provide me with convenience, so the same freedom as I had with my own car, essentially, at a lower cost, I'll switch. So if we look at Vancouver, I know not everybody is from Vancouver. We heard this morning we're a bit of a unicorn. There's no ride-hailing here, but there's 4 car-sharing providers which have created an ecosystem that is reliable for the Vancouver population. So there's about 3,300 car-share vehicles between 2 station-based models, Zipcar and Modo, and 2 free-floaters, Evo and Car2Go. Plus, we have about 1,500 Mobi bikes. So we have an ecosystem, and 31% of Vancouver's population use car sharing. That's about 200,000 people. It's pretty impressive, knowing that we don't have any ride-hailing, which normally causes a lot of the rise. I also probably don't need to tell the people in this room that car sharing has been surveyed and studied for years. This is one of the studies that focused on free-floating, so the Car2Go model, you pick it up in one location, drop it off in a completely different one, and has looked at 5 different US cities and found consistently that people own less cars. In fact, the researchers estimated that 28,000 vehicles were taken off the road. So either people sold their first car, sold their second car, or didn't purchase another vehicle. If you put that into a visual, that's 88 football fields of space. That is a lot of space where you can do a lot of other things. Build a hospital, I don't know, build a school, a new residential tower. The other thing they found is that members consistently drive less. The average North American drives between 8,000 and 12,000 kilometers a year. Car-sharing members in those 5 cities drove between 6 and 16% less. There is a bit of a variance because it depended on the city. So we know there's less car ownership, and more space available in the cities. There's less driving, which translates into less congestion and less greenhouse gases. So what happens now if we put AV in the mix? Because once you put AV in the mix, a ride-hailing company and a car-sharing company is essentially kind of the same thing, except that the car-sharing company knows how to manage their assets. Well, if you don't remember anything from my presentation except this one acronym, that would be great. FAVES is a term that was coined by Robin Chase's daughter, not by movmi. It stands for fleets of autonomous vehicles that are electric and shared. And the focus is on fleets, because we really believe the only way to introduce autonomous in urban centers is using them as fleets. And I want to give you examples of how the technology then can help improve some of our current challenges. And I'm going back to the car-sharing fleets because I think we could learn a lot from them if we analyze them and use those learnings for when autonomous is happening. So currently, our shared mobility fleets are underutilized, so we could increase the utilization. And I'll give you an example for all of this. We could create more flexible public transit offerings. We heard a lot about this already today. And we can introduce transportation options to new demographics. So the first example, free-floating services like Car2Go or dockless bike share have one big problem, a demand and supply problem, making sure that they're in the right location at the right time. To give you an example from here in Vancouver, Car2Go used to run a satellite station at Horseshoe Bay. It's extremely popular because Horseshoe Bay is where the ferry terminal is that connects people from the mainland to Vancouver Island, Bowen Island, and the Sunshine Coast. So visitors, or people from the city who wanted to go to these destinations, would use them. But also people from Bowen Island and the Sunshine Coast heavily relied on those vehicles to get back into the city, because sometimes the bus was full, I don't know, they needed to go somewhere where public transit couldn't take them, so that's what they did. Problem was, on the long weekend, the entire parking lot, lower level, was full of Car2Gos. So Car2Go needed to shuttle them back because people were away and they didn't need to have that many vehicles at Horseshoe Bay, but they needed them in the city. They tried for about 5 years and eventually closed down that location. So that shows you the extent. I mean, the bike shares, the image itself speaks for itself, so I don't have to explain that. So once you put big data, machine learning, all the additional technology that comes with AV in the mix, you no longer have this problem, and the car can drive itself back. So you don't have 11 drivers going out moving the cars somewhere where they're guessing that somebody would need them. The second issue, and we talked about this already, is we're all focused, shared mobility providers are all focused on the big cities where you have public transit system, maybe not quite like Tokyo's, but that look pretty dense. Unfortunately, by 2030, 50% of the world's population will be living in cities with less than 500,000 people, and we also need to figure out how to solve their transportation challenges, because if we don't think about it now, maybe by 2050, we'll have the same problems that we're trying to solve in the big cities today. We're currently working on a project in Seminole County in Florida, which is a bit of a greenfield project, because it's a developer that is building an entire community outside of Orlando that after 10 years will have about 18,000 residents. It's a mixed community, so work, live, play all together. And what we're doing right now is we're trying to figure out how can you bring in these shared mobility options, so car sharing, bike sharing, mobility hubs, but also AV shuttles in a smart way now that when autonomous technology becomes more available, this is already set up so it connects to the main public transit arteries. And we're hoping that this project could be kind of a blueprint, maybe for other rural areas. And then the last point I want to make, we currently serve exactly the same demographic with all our shared mobility services. Young, urbanites, professionals have generally secondary degree and a higher level of income. We haven't figured out, at least on the shared mobility side, how to serve the older demographic that is no longer allowed to drive, or if you have a daughter or a son that needs to go to school and then to a play date and then to ballet, how do you make all these connections? And that's where I also think the autonomous shuttle projects that are popping up across the globe have a huge potential. This is a tiny town in the Swiss mountains. That's where I'm originally from. That's where my accent is from. It's 30,000 people. This shuttle has been running for 2 years, and it connects the train station with the rest of the city. It's become a bit of a tourist attraction. So people not only go to Sion to see the mountains, but also to try out the little shuttle bus. And what is interesting, they decided to survey everybody that gets on the bus and off. And people younger than 20 and older than 50 are most excited about this service. And what's also interesting, as much as there is no driver in this little shuttle bus, there is somebody that supervises the bus, but is also a customer service agent. So talking about job shifts, maybe there will be a lot more customer service jobs available once we're moving towards AV. So how can AV change transportation? Essentially, we can change or fix some of our supply and demand issues that we currently are struggling with. We could create a more dynamic public transit system that feeds into the main arteries, and we could create more transportation equity for demographics that we currently can't serve. Having said that, the only way of doing that is if we're focusing on fleets of autonomous vehicles. Thank you.